The Hexi DLC is about to change everything. Here's where every PvE build stands going into the Hexi Expansion. We are going to see which ones are the best for solo PvE and multiplayer PvE. As a disclaimer, this tier list represents my personal opinion based on my own experience as someone who has played with all the build paths and who has over 1000 hours of playtime in the game. I'm not going to cover any PvP aspects in this video because I rarely play PvP, so it would be ridiculous for me to make a tier list without too much experience. We are only going to look at the recommended combinations of martial arts because those are generally the best for PvE with a few exceptions. We are going to have two tier lists, one for solo PvE and one for multiplayer PvE, meaning Heroes Realm and Sword Trial. For solo PvE, we're going to look at two factors to decide the rankings: overall DPS potential and how consistent the build is, meaning if it can do well even if you make a few mistakes. For multiplayer PvE, we are going to look at two factors to decide the rankings: overall DPS potential and how much overall impact the build has in a multiplayer game mode. Let's get right into it, starting with solo PvE. First, we have the Bell Strike Splendor path, which has great burst DPS and can delete the chi bar of enemies rather quickly, but it definitely does not have one of the highest DPS in the game, since it's more of a PvP oriented build. It's also fairly inconsistent due to most of your damage coming from charged attacks, which are easy to miss, and it also requires perfect endurance management to get the most out of it. For this reason, for solo PvE, I would put this build in A tier. Next, we have the Bell Strike Umbra path, which has one of the highest DPS in the game due to the bleed mechanic, and it can simply sustain insane DPS fairly easily with very basic combos, almost impossible to mess up. For these reasons, I would place this build in the S tier. Next, we have the Bamboo Cut Wind path, one of the top DPS builds in the game when played right. Once you learn how to perfect dodge, this build can dish out crazy damage in very short time. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of setup, and just one mistake can mess up your entire rotation, since you have to play very aggressively while perfectly dodging enemy attacks. For these reasons, I would put this build in the A tier. Next, we have the Silkbind Jade path, which is one of the highest DPS builds in the game, and with the recent buffs, it's now even better in solo PvE content as well. It's also very easy to play and land all of your combos, and it can absolutely destroy most bosses in the game, especially humanoid enemies. For these reasons, I would put this build in the S tier. Next, we have the Stone Split Might path, which doesn't necessarily have high DPS, but for some odd reason it can delete the enemy's health bar in 2 hits by pressing 2 buttons. It's easy to play, almost impossible to die with it or miss your combos, and it deals a ton of damage. For these reasons, I would put this build in the S tier. Lastly, we have the Silkbind Deluge build, which is the healer build in this game. This build has basically 0 DPS from its own skills, but it relies on mystic skills to deal all of its damage. It gets a 20% damage boost for mystic skills, and if you can chain something like Dragon's Breath plus Drunken Poet, you can dish out similar DPS to the other builds. It's fairly easy to play and it's hard to die because you have so much healing, but at the same time it doesn't outshine any of the other builds in solo PvE. For this reason, I will put this build in the B tier. This is the final tier list for solo PvE content, with Bell Strike Umbra, Silkbind Jade and Stone Split Might in S tier based on my own experience. Let's move on to the multiplayer PvE tier list. Starting off again with the Bell Strike Splendor, the build deals great DPS, although not the highest, but it's very easy to land your combos without getting interrupted since the enemy will focus on someone else. Impact wise, the build deals more chi damage than the others, so it can help deplete the boss chi bar slightly faster, but that's pretty much it. I would put this build in the A tier again, same as for solo PvE. Moving on to the Bell Strike Umbra path, the build still maintains top tier DPS, it's even easier to land your combos, and utility wise it can reduce the enemy's defense by 5%, making everyone else in your party deal more damage. For this reason, I would put this again in S tier. Next, we have the Bamboo Cut Wind path, which still has top tier DPS in group content, however it's now even harder to land your full combos, because usually enemies move around a ton, and you rely a lot on being in very close range to the enemy to dish out maximum DPS. The build has no additional impact in multiplayer PvE content. For these reasons, I would put it again in A tier. Next, we have the Silkbind Jade path, which becomes even better in multiplayer PvE, as you can land your combos even more consistently, and you can just chill back while maintaining top DPS. Nothing changes impact wise, but it's still one of the best PvE builds. For these reasons, I will put the build again in S tier. Next we have the Stone Split Might Path, which maintains similar DPS in group content, but now this build gains a ton of party impacting potential. Your skills can make the boss deal reduced damage and take more damage from the entire team, making it very useful in multiplayer content, besides the very high damage it can deal. Not to mention that this is the only true tank build in the game, so you will feel the tank role most of the time, which is mandatory in almost any multiplayer PvE mode. For this reason, the build is yet again put in S tier. And lastly, we have the Silkbind Deluge path, which has literally 0 DPS in group content because you are focused on healing and shielding allies, but now it is by far the most impacting build in multiplayer PvE. You can heal and revive your allies, provide them with damage buffs, increase the boss exhaustion state, revive yourself and shield your allies. For all of these reasons alone, despite having 0 DPS, I would put this build in S tier. And there you have it, my personal tier list for solo and multiplayer PvE content based on my own personal experience with all the paths in the game. Let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with the list. I will post an updated version of this tier list after the Hexi DLC arrives with the 2 new paths. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.